If a culture eats strategy for breakfast, then obviously our company culture is important. But are we really nurturing it and examining the right metrics? Now, if you're on the fence about the importance of workplace culture, here are some stats that might help you look at it perhaps a little bit differently. They say company culture is an important factor for 46% of job seekers. 94% of entrepreneurs and 88% of job seekers say that a healthy culture at work is vital for success. Now, 86% of job seekers actually avoid companies with bad reputations. Team leaders have the highest impact on company culture, and having highly engaged employees can lead to a 202% increase in performance. The culture that attracts high caliber employees leads to a 33% revenue increase. Now, our guests will hopefully provide us with answers on how to best improve the work culture and measure it effectively. And we'll get to that in a moment. Hello and welcome to the Predictable B2B Success podcast brought to you by Sproutwith.com. I'm Vinay Koshy, and our guest is Doug Camplejohn. Doug, you are the Chief Fun Officer, CEO, and founder at Airspeed. You're an accomplished tech executive, entrepreneur, and startup advisor with well over 2 decades of experience in the industry. Now, Airspeed, of course, is a platform designed to connect and celebrate employees digitally. But prior to Airspeed, I believe you've held several leadership roles at innovative tech companies, including the likes of LinkedIn, Microsoft, and Salesforce. In fact, at LinkedIn, you were the vice president of product management for sales solutions, where you led the development of LinkedIn's Sales Navigator product. You also worked at Salesforce as the EVP and GM of Sales Cloud. At the moment, you're an active investor and advisor to several early stage startups and quite a frequent speaker at industry events. I'm curious, Doug, with your journey to date, what would you say? Was there a specific incident or event that created the desire to build Airspeed to what it is today?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Vinay. Airspeed came about during COVID, like a lot of other businesses. I had been recruited, as you mentioned, to be the GM of Sales Cloud for Salesforce, and I started in February of 2020. So 6 weeks later, all of a sudden, we're all on Zoom calls. We're all working from our living rooms. And on the one hand, I love the flexibility. I'm not going into an office, but I really missed people. And we did all the same stuff that everybody else tried. We tried Zoom happy hours and Zoom yoga and lots of fun Slack channels and a bunch of additional all hands meetings. And after a few months of doing that, I just realized that this stuff was just scattered all over the place. There was no kind of system of record for culture. There's no operating system for culture. And that's really where we set out to start Airspeed.
And given your journey to date, what would you say would be your personal area of strength?
I think I'm good at the blank page, right? And so I think that what I really enjoy most is starting with something that the idea hasn't been done before, or certainly done in the way that I'm thinking of it, that the team hasn't been put together yet. I like coming in and just doing it all from scratch and figuring out along the way. And despite what you read in TechCrunch or listen to tech startup podcasts, it's almost never a straight line. So that journey of figuring out, like, how do you go down one alley, back out and go down the other thing and kind of work your way through the Harry Potter maze and get to the end with success.
Brilliant. And in that area of strength is, what would you say would be something that businesses don't know but should?
In that area of strength, I think there's multiple ways to answer that question. Let me take one tack. I think that I have learned that I think perseverance wins as a personal characteristic. I think that, and for businesses, I think one of the things that I started my career at Apple, and Microsoft was the enemy at that time, the big bad guys up in Redmond. And the thing that I've grown to really appreciate, especially under Satya's leadership now, is how good they are at persevering when they believe the initial hypothesis is correct. So if you look at a lot of Microsoft's historical products, they've changed this recently with things like Teams that they've done very well with. But historically, they would fail on the first couple of attempts. Windows was a failure for the first couple of attempts. Some of the things they did with some of their Office suite was a failure. But they knew the original hypothesis was correct, and they still believed in the hypothesis, and they kept persevering and finally achieved it.
Now, obviously, culture is important, but perhaps a lot of people have in their minds what what you were exposed to and all of us were exposed to early in COVID, where everything was done through things like Zoom, and perhaps going back a little further, this idea of throwing in perhaps some office ping pong tables, t-shirts and beer bashes. What would you say to such folk who perhaps still think of those as being important to the overall culture?
Yeah, culture, what I would say is culture really comes down to how you embody your values day by day. And that comes into most focus on the people that you hire and fire. I think that you look at like Enron used to have their company values etched in the lobby, and one of them was integrity, which is obviously a load of crap, right? Because they weren't actually bringing on people or exhibiting those values themselves. So I think that culture is not about free beer bashes and ping pong tables or any of those things we used to think about in the physical world. It's really about making sure that you have a set of values that you're living day by day through your actions and who you bring on and let go. And I think that one of the big misconceptions about culture is people are like, it's soft and fuzzy. We can't measure it. We can't manage it. Software can't help with that. And I think what our aim with Airspeed is to disprove that. I think we're, as we said, building an operating system for culture. And our belief is in the future, you'll collaborate with Slack, you'll communicate with Zoom, and you'll connect with Airspeed.
Excellent. Yeah, so the idea of culture, to just to ensure we're all on the same page here, is not so much in the activities that are done, but in the kinds of behaviors and actions you engage in on a near daily basis, a lot of which would perhaps stem from the values that you hold close to the way you operate. Would you therefore say that at a base level for any organization, codifying the culture becomes really important? And not in just a big manual, so to speak, but something
Yeah.
that's fairly easily digestible by everyone within the organization.
I think it's good to write that stuff down. I'm generally not a fan of, I know Amazon has 12 cultural principles or something like that, and I think that's just too many. We keep it really simple at Airspeed. We call it polar, like polar bear, passion, learning, and results. And that's the three of our kind of cultural tenets. But I think whether you write it or down or not is less important than what you actually do. So you can say, these are my cultural values. But then if somebody comes into your organization that really breaks those values and you don't take action on them, you
Mm.
basically said your values don't mean anything.
Yep.
So I think it's really important to have those actions and those reinforcement steps. And I think that great cultures really boil down to building a culture of trust.
Mm.
And trust is just showing you consistent behavior over time. So again, I think great cultures are ones where you have obviously great people who are aligned around a mission and get to that layer of trust where the default behavior is, I assume you're doing the right thing or doing your best.
Mhm.
Terrible cultures are ones where you're like, I assume the opposite. Therefore, I think you're trying to do something to politically outmaneuver me. And there just becomes distrust. And those are the most toxic cultures out there.
Excellent. And now technology has suddenly come to the forefront. You're heavily involved with that in terms of cultivating culture. But can you explain how technology and perhaps specifically software can play a part in shaping a company's culture?
Yeah. And so, if you look at Facebook, for example, what Mark set out to do was to say, here's a set of tools to help me facilitate my personal relationships, right?
Mhm.
I can know your relationship status. I can see what activities you're doing. I can keep in touch with photos and things like that. Um, we're really taking a lot of things that I used to do in the physical world and lots of leaders do in the physical world and trying to make them easier in the digital world. And so we almost think about Airspeed as an Iron Man suit for managers, a co-pilot for managers to help them do the
Mhm.
right thing. So I'll give you a couple examples. In my old companies, new employee would come on, we'd take them to lunch. We have 5 questions we'd ask every new employee, things like first concert, most embarrassing moment, something we'd be surprised to know about you, et cetera. And we'd have a great lunch. And everybody at that lunch would learn a little bit about that employee. We felt more connected to that person. 2 problems with that. One is anybody who wasn't at that lunch, hired later, didn't make the lunch, had no idea what that person's answers were. And 2 is that person never got to know the answers of everybody else they were at the lunch with.
Mhm.
So we have one of our 6 apps is a simple app called Intros that when you join a Slack workspace, you automatically get a standard set of questions that the company has decided they want to ask all new employees or all new project team members. And you get to see what their answers are. And that person can scroll back through that channel and also see what everybody else's answers are.
Yeah. Right. So it's almost like creating a bit of a compendium that allows people to relate to each other. What about ongoing activities and ways of engaging?
Yeah, so I'll give another great example. So I learned this at LinkedIn. So Jeff Weiner and Ryan Roslansky, Jeff was the CEO and now Ryan's the CEO. Great leaders and we used to do this thing called personal wins and shout outs. And we go around the room and everybody would give a personal win in their life from the last week and give a shout out to a person or team. Few problems with that. It was, by the way, great. It was really a great way to humanize the meeting. Few problems is one is, again, if you weren't in that meeting, you missed everything. 2 is if you had 15 or more people in that room, which we did, it took half the meeting. It was like a half an hour, 45-minute exercise just to go around the room. 3 is if you were giving a shout out to somebody who wasn't in that room, that person never got the benefit of the recognition. And finally, you're describing things with words. So we have 2 of our apps. One is shout outs. So you can go give somebody direct recognition and it goes into the channel. It's well structured about what did that person do? What was the impact? What company values it represented? But the thing I really like is that you can recommend recognition. So if my VP of engineering says someone on his team did an amazing job and he could give them direct recognition, but it would be more effective coming from me, he can write it up. It comes to me. I basically review it, put it into my words, and I send the recognition directly. So that's an example of a better process. We have another app called Icebreakers, which we use every week in our team meeting. So 24 hours before that meeting, I get a little Slack notification that says, hey, what's a personal win for you from last week? And because it's Slack and I can use it on my phone, I can actually attach a video, I can attach a photo, and we take the first maybe 5 or 10 minutes of every team meeting. And I just literally open up Slack, open up the app and go see people's responses. And I can see, oh, that's what your new baby looks like, or that's a new house you got, or any of that stuff. And I have learned more about people I've worked with for over a decade in the last few months than the previous 10 years.
Very, very interesting. I'm curious though, you mentioned Slack. So I'm assuming that commonly used platforms like Slack could well be integrated with things like Airspeed. Would that be the case? Okay.
Yeah. So I was going to say, yeah, our apps today are on Slack. We will expand in the future and offer them on other platforms where people are like Teams or have a standalone web or mobile experience as well.
With remote work, at times you're dealing with different time zones. I'm curious, how can we cultivate that culture across time zones when it's early morning for someone else and late night for other folks, etc.? How does Airspeed or platforms like Airspeed help with that?
Yeah, so I think one of the great benefits or outcomes of us all living through COVID was it was this worldwide empathy experiment where remote work has existed forever. But we've had people, what I like to say is you could be working in a different city or you could be working on a different floor of the same building. And you might as well be remote. So we've all had remote work at different levels. I think for those of us who worked in headquarters, we probably had less empathy for people in remote sales offices, remote development offices than we now do post-COVID. So Airspeed is totally a virtual company. We're on 5 continents. We have no offices right now. And we are trying to be very sensitive to time zones. We generally do things early in the morning, like 7 or 8 a.m. for team stand-ups. But we also have an app called Maps where everybody can put their location is, not real-time tracking, just your city and state. And what's beautiful about that, and our customers who use that, is that I can go look up and say, oh, I'm traveling to New York City. Who else is there? Oh, let me go zoom in on them. Let me check a few. Let me send them a Slack message and say, hey, do you guys want to meet up for dinner on Tuesday? Or things like that. So you can facilitate personal meetups and also see from a time zone standpoint, what would be a good kind of medium ground that would work for everybody.
Yeah. It's interesting that you alluded to COVID being something of an empathy experiment. I'm curious, what should we be measuring in order to ensure that our culture's on track? Most people look at employee experience surveys and things of that nature, which, in my opinion, tend to be a bit of a lagging indicator. What would be your take on being able to measure it then tabs on it effect.
Yeah, I think the whole employee survey stuff is it's fine as a baseline, but you're, as you said, you're getting data points once or twice a year. Generally, people are overinflating their answers because they're worried that this really isn't private. So I don't think it's a really good test. We will be doing stuff that I think is taking a very different approach to that. But the very simple thing I have certain kind of schemas or modes for hiring, retention, and firing. And one of the things for retention is just if I'm on a face-to-face Zoom or meeting somebody in person, I just ask them, are you having fun?
Hmm.
I find people are really bad at lying about that. If they pause too long or their voice goes up an octave, you know that there's something wrong and you got to go dig into that. And I think that's, you've got to constantly be checking in with people and pressure testing that and not just waiting for some big annual employee NPS survey.
So you're recommending that we do this small one-on-one as opposed to having any measures
I,
in place?
I think you can do it both ways, right? I think
Okay.
that you can have the annual review, obviously, and it's a good way for baselining, give some information there. I think something a little bit more lightweight is what we're thinking about. I think the idea of, hey, just how are you doing this week? It could be a green, yellow, red. It could be a thumbs up, thumbs down. It could be a set of emojis like I'm sick, I'm tired, I'm burnt out, whatever. It should be anything. Anytime you do that, it should be completely anonymous. So you can just say, I want to say this, but I don't want anybody to know it came from me. Or I could opt in and say, no, I actually want my manager to know I'm burned out or I'm stressed. We're all that become pretty conditioned to responding with a simple emoji. And that's a very lightweight action, whether it's a Facebook thumbs up or an Instagram heart. So I think that's the level of check-in you want to do. And that's harder to do in person. My manager at Salesforce during COVID would literally go around the room and saying, tell us, Doug, are you green, yellow, or red? And again, because it was in front of everybody, people probably overinflated how they were doing.
Mhm.
And it just didn't feel as genuine as something where I could just have a lightweight process to go do that. So I think that's more of how we think about kind of temperature checking your team on a more regular basis.
Certainly. And with the values that you would like your team to embrace and perhaps
Mhm.
showcasing in their actions and behaviors, are you looking specifically for things that they do in order to ensure that you're on track, or are there other ways of examining how you?
Yeah. So again, we use our own products, their shout outs. So we have in shout outs, you can specify what your company values are. So
Mhm.
ours are passion, learning, and results. One of the interesting phenomena we found is that we watched our customers and when they were giving shout outs, and it goes up as the week goes on. So
Mhm.
Fridays was the number one day for giving feedback. So we came out with a feature called Feel Good Fridays you can opt into. And Feel Good Fridays just say, hey, beginning of the day, now's a great day to tell people on your team and recognize people who are doing great work. And then it summarizes that at the end of the day of who's given what. But one of the cool things about this all being structured, it's all sitting in database as opposed to just free text in the Slack channel, is that you can start to do some pretty interesting AI stuff with it. For example, for one of our customers, we took a look at the shout outs they had given over the last quarter. And
Mhm.
we said, okay, who best represents this company value based on the shout outs they've given? Or come up with 5 awards for this company based on the shout outs that we've seen given in the last quarter. And that's where ChatGPT type technology is incredibly good.
That's very interesting. I'm also curious. In some circles, there's a lot of talk around the use of culture champions. How would you define them within the organization, and how would you say companies should identify and empower these champions in order to drive the culture?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think culture champions are incredibly important. They're often not who you think you are. When you say culture, you often say, oh, go talk to my head of HR. But if you actually ask people inside of a company who are the culture
Mm.
champions, they know. And it's often,
Mhm.
somebody who might not be even in the executive team, might be somebody at a different level. They've just got the spirit of the company. They're embodying those values, et cetera. We actually, the first kind of patent we worked on was something we call culture graph. And still a work in progress, but the ultimate exploration is how do you find these connectors? How do you find these culture champions inside of the company? How do you determine how connected or not connected a team or set of people are inside of a company. So I think they're incredibly important to find and to be able to support. We have a customer who, for example, has about 1,500 employees. And what they've done is they've said, hey, anytime we have more than, I think it was like 25 people in a city, we're going to actually give budget to that group of people and figure out who the culture champion is for that group. And then that person can go organize local meetups and go spend dollars and get some more face time as well in these cities where they don't have an office. So I think that those culture champions are really the linchpin of kind of spreading the culture throughout the company. I'll also say one of the things that was fascinating to me when we went from this 30-person startup to 10,000 plus employees at LinkedIn when we got acquired was how deliberate the executive team was at cascading communications. They were incredibly good at saying, here's our mission, here's our vision, repeating that all the time, saying, here's our goals for the year and goals for the quarter. And then that would be repeated many times and cascaded where people were getting that same message. And I think what COVID taught us is we have to be as deliberate about cascading culture. And that not only comes from the top, but it has to be those culture champions who amplify.
With culture champions, you're looking at people who take the initiative on their own. Is that the case? Okay, certainly.
Yeah.
You talked a little bit about hiring, and perhaps I'd like to come to this idea of hiring and firing decisions. Obviously, that's a reflection on the culture. You mentioned Enron as well. I'm curious, how would you suggest we look at this idea of hiring and firing in order to be consistent with the overall idea of company's culture?
Yeah, I'll give you an example for what we do at Airspeed. So I've tried multiple tests over the couple decades of my career to figure out how do you get A players and like weed out the B and below players. And we've tried everything, thumbs up, thumbs down after the interview panel or scale of 1 to 5, any of that stuff. And none of that seems to work. The only thing that's worked really well for me is what we call the awesome test. So after everybody's gone through, we part of our interview process is somebody has to give a final presentation, and then the company gets together the people who are at that, debriefs afterwards. And the only question I have is that person, I'll just swear, like fucking awesome, right? If that person is not if you don't go, oh my God, we need that person in the company, keep looking. If it's not as someone said, if it's not a fuck yes, it's a hell no. And that's the way we think about it. That's the test that keeps your bar really high, right? And we've said goodbye to some amazing people who have gone on to very successful careers. But for us, it just didn't have that grab us by the heart, grab us by the gut feeling of we need to go work with that person. And part of the lens we use for those people are those 3 values that I mentioned. So passion, is that person passionate about what we're working on? Is that person passionate about this problem? Is that person passionate about their job and what they do? Is that person learning? Is that person got a growth mindset where they're like, hey, here's what I want to learn next. Here's what I want to keep growing. Here's not a fixed mindset. Here's how do I keep advancing and expanding the pie and finding results? Somebody who is just wants to talk to us about what they achieved, not just the effort they put in. So that's how we measure all of that in the hiring process and ultimately make sure that the people we're bringing in are high caliber and meet our values.
Great points there. I'm also curious with something like Airspeed, I'm assuming that there has been the need to educate the market, not just for the need, but as to what the product is capable of. I'm curious, what does that look like?
I think so educating the market on Airspeed so far has been easier than I expected. We just launched in March of 23 and within 5 months crossed over 100,000 users on the platform. And most of that has been organic. So nearly 60% of it comes through the Slack app store. Some through the Slack app store, comes through our blog posts or podcasts or the way that people find out about us on LinkedIn, et cetera. We have done some advertising to test the market and the ROI of that has been very good. But for the most part, people know these tenets, these moments of culture. How do I onboard a new employee to the team? How do I give recognition properly? How do I get to know my people a little bit more in meetings and not just make my workday a bunch of dull back-to-back Zoom meetings? How do I see where people are and help organize local meetups? We have an app called Coffee Talk. It's about how do you find people that you don't normally meet with and get to know other people in your organization. So it turns out these are all things that people intuitively know they should be doing or want to do better. So that growth for us has been pretty easy and organic so far.
Yeah, brilliant. With this idea of education, what would you see the future of platforms like Airspeed being, given the evolution of technology and large language models, etc.? Do you see it being more integrated with other collaborative apps that are currently being using, or is there a different picture altogether that you're envisioning?
I think that we believe that one of the insights we had in Airspeed is go to where the users are, which sounds obvious in hindsight, but it's not always, as I said, startups are not always a straight line. So we didn't start there, but the going to where people are spending their attention, Slack and eventually Teams, makes a lot of sense for us. And for a couple of reasons, one of which is if you look at most HR tech, most people tech, it's sold top down to HR, and HR tries to get everybody to use it. And for things that you have to do, like an HRIS system where you're like, I need to find out when an employee started or see who reports to whom, that makes total sense. But for something like this, you don't want to have to say, oh, yeah, there's yet another system I go to. That's why for us, starting with Slack made the most sense. And what we've seen it. We see basically people finding us at a department level, starting out. I'll give you an example. A new bank, one of the largest neobanks in the world, largest bank in Latin America, installed us back in March, started out with four Slack channels and 400 users. And every month they just kept adding people. They're now like 97 channels and 2,300 users, just organic. Like we haven't done anything. And that's a very common story for us. So one is that kind of coming in at a manager level rather than tops down is big. And the second one is our usage is just off the charts. So we're getting in these larger organizations like 85% weekly active usage. If you compare that to most HR apps, they're lucky if they get like 25% monthly usage. And the net of all of that is that we're collecting a lot more high quality data to go feed AI models. And I think that's ultimately the way you want to interact with these things, whether it's in an app like Slack or whether it's a standalone experience.
And I'm curious, what would you say has been the biggest driver for creating growth over the past year?
Yeah, we're still partway through our first year, but I think the biggest driver has frankly been kind of awareness through the platforms like Slack App Store and then word of mouth. I think there's been a couple of interesting surprises, right? Or learnings. One of which is Slack. There's actually a lot of Slack communities, which I didn't realize. People who are doing these women in tech, or I'm an investor in an angel fund. We do have a few hundred people that are in a Slack workspace there. And those have been great awareness lead gen things for us because they'll like a workspace like GTM fund that I'm part of will install our intros app so that everybody coming into the workspace introduces themselves in a consistent fashion. Or they'll install our Maps app so they can say, hey, and then you can include in Maps where you're traveling to. So if you're like, hey, I'm traveling to Chicago next week, other people can see that. I can help facilitate a local meetup that way. So that's been an interesting free customer acquisition front for us that we didn't expect.
Brilliant. Very interesting that you were able to facilitate a lot of conversations organically, which results in things like referrals. That's an interesting perspective. In given your experiences with the past companies, what would you say would be your personal views on how culture for you has evolved? And perhaps what would you say are also some critical lessons in building the right team dynamics early on for say, an early stage company or a startup?
Yeah, we talked about the hiring and the retention part. The thing we haven't talked about, and it's not a fun topic, is firing. And I think that is where the rubber meets the road of how serious you are about culture. I didn't invent this. This was done by the greats Reed Hastings and Patty McCord at Netflix, but the famous culture deck that they came up with had something called the keeper test. And the idea there was if somebody on your team said, I'm leaving for a similar opportunity tomorrow, how hard would you fight to keep them? And if the answer is not that hard, then you should probably walk them out the door now. And if the answer is, oh my God, I would do everything to go keep that person, you should think about what are those things you can do now. You get more responsibility, more title, more stock, more salary, because that's how you reinforce your culture. And I think that the minute you start going, okay, I know that person isn't an A, but we've got to fill the position. It's been open for 6 months. You've basically signed the death warrant on your culture. You've started to already degrade what you're going to go do, or you compromise on values. Somebody violates one of those values in a very obvious way to everybody else, and you don't do anything about it, then you basically said they're just words on a piece of paper.
That's interesting, because it brings to mind the question that in what ways should leaders actually live the values they advocate for in their companies?
100%. I think culture is, you do have these culture champions, and
Yeah.
culture ultimately is the amalgam of everybody that's in the company, but starts at the top, right? So you can't say everybody should live this one value and you live something else. Just doesn't work that way. And I've been very fortunate I've had both large company experience and small company experience, and gotten to meet folks like Steve Jobs, one of my early heroes, and work with great leaders like Jeff Weiner and Mark Benioff. And those are people, like, if you talk about living your values, like Mark just puts it out there. There's no question what Mark's values are. He's very vocal about it. It gets embodied throughout the whole company. And I think it's a huge reason why Salesforce is such a great organization.
What would you say about transparency, especially from a leadership point of view?
I think it's very important. I think transparency is, we try to be we try to fill the line between, or be on balance between not people's privacy. So we don't want to say, here's everybody's salary, here's everybody's compensation. If somebody's having an HR issue, obviously we're not airing that laundry publicly. But I think for most of the things, we're very transparent. We share at Airspeed and previous companies. We've been like, here's the board deck that we just gave. Here's everybody can see how we're doing on our pipeline. Everyone at Airspeed now, because we're kind of product market fit stage, but we're pre-go-to-market fit. Everybody literally is hands-on bug bashing the product every week and giving input, and everything. Every customer conversation we have is shared in Slack channels with transcriptions and summaries. So as much as you can share. So I think you assume you've hired adults who are going to be responsible with that information. And the more data points they have, the better they can all be at their job. So even though an engineer might not need to know what such and such a customer is saying about something he or she is not working on, that still is going to inform their decisions and make them more tuned and connected to customer feedback.
Just listening to some things that you've said, I get the impression that you would encourage employees not just to focus on work, but to share aspects of their lives that relate to family or friends, or some of their hobbies and things of that nature. I wonder if that's something that's actively encouraged in most companies, and should be, because it starts to get a little bit messy for some people. In terms of bringing what is not work related into the picture.
Yeah. And I think everybody deserves to have their privacy respected. So if you don't want to share that stuff, that is totally fine. And the way, for example, what we do with our Icebreakers each week is, it's totally opt-in. You can choose whether to share or not. You can share what you want to share. But there's a really interesting phenomena. So one of our advisors is a guy named Chris Lockhead, and he invented one of the godfathers of category design. And Chris also talks a lot about this digital native versus analog native. And, it's not an exact science, but roughly if you're over, say, 35 or 40, like I am, you are an analog native, right? You go to someone's door and you ring the doorbell, right? If you're a digital native, that feels rude to you. You just text the person inside and say, here, right? So it's just a completely different reality. And it was amazing when as we started building the company in the early days, my execs and I are in that over 40 category. And we're pretty open about sharing stuff, but there's things like, okay, I don't know if I would share X or Y. As soon as you get people in their 20s and 30s in the company, they're like, I'm just going to share everything. There you go. And I think that's what you find with this latest generation, Gen Z, is you get people who expect to have that level of transparency and connection and kind of emotional support in some ways in the work environment. They don't want it to be a transaction. They want it to
Mm.
be something that has a meaning and something that has bigger purpose.
So, well, if we're embracing the person as well, would you say there's a place for feedback mechanisms, not just related to work performance, but perhaps to personal growth as well?
I think, listen, I think that uh, there's this phrase of bring your whole self to work kind of
Mm.
idea. And I think that in a lot of ways, what companies try to do in some of their perks, we're offering daycare, we're offering a gym, we're offering counseling services. Headspace Health, for example, is a great company that provides these kind of, platforms
Mhm.
for doing that, are about recognizing that, listen, actually having the whole person be in good shape physically, mentally, emotionally is actually great for the bottom line as well, because you've got
Mhm.
somebody who is actually operating at their highest capacity. And so I think that it's not just altruistic. Obviously, there's a motive for companies to want to do that, but I think it's important to not just say, "Hey, you come here and this is all about work and productivity," and then you go home and have all the other stuff, because most of our life is spent at work, right?
Mhm.
We spend more hours of the day at work than we do waking hours at home often, and that means that it should be fun. My whole belief is if you're not loving what you do, I'm not saying every single day, but in general, passionate about what you're working on, enjoying the people you're working with, feeling like you're growing and learning, you're doing the wrong thing.
Mm. That makes a lot of sense. So, in terms of defining success and happiness in a professional organization, sorry, a professional setting, how can uh, organizations help align with individual definitions? Because I think it would differ from
Yeah.
person to person.
Yeah. I think I'm a big believer in working backwards in lots
Mhm.
of things. So I think the more that you can work with an individual and say, where do you want to be? Right. What's the state like? And it could be in a year, it could be in 5 years, it could be in 10 years, but somebody might say, I want to be a CEO of a startup, or I want to be a chief marketing officer or whatever, and say, great, let's figure out what are the paths to go get there. And how do I help you on that journey? And I think that's what great leaders do. I had the good fortune years ago of meeting the legendary Bill Campbell, who was known as coach throughout Silicon Valley, worked at Apple and Claris and coached Zuckerberg and the Google guys, et cetera. And when I think that he was such a legendary leader in supporting other people, that when he left Claris, his employees took out a full page ad in the Wall Street Journal thanking him. Right. So that to me is like the pinnacle of supportive leadership, where you have said, no, this is not just about the company reaching the end stage. This is about investing in the employees and their own journeys. And the end result of that is you get productivity, profitability, all that stuff are downstream effects of getting that upstream stuff. I look at it and go, if I'm as successful as I want to be in Airspeed as I've been in previous companies, the people who work here should look back at this time in their lives and say, that's one of the best places I ever worked, because I learned a ton. I really loved what we were working on. It felt like we made a little dent in the universe, and I really grew as an individual and as a professional.
Certainly. And I would assume that certainly a big part of that is empathy. And I'm curious, we may be all into culture, but should there be a focus on increasing each individual's empathetic potential? And if so, how would you prescribe that we invest in that?
Absolutely. I think that's increasingly important. And I think that being a parent, you learn some of that
Mhm.
stuff as well. I think the first time I heard the term microaggression was with my kids and an incident in school. I think that there are phenomenal training classes, whether it's LinkedIn Learning or any of the platforms, for helping you just understand what's like from someone else's perspective.
Mhm.
I did a volunteering event once, and it was with prisoners who were trying to come out and rehabilitate themselves and start something when they got on the outside. And the woman who was leading this from this nonprofit had a great phrase, which is, some of us are born on third base and think we hit a triple.
Mhm.
And I think that empathy is about realizing what your privilege is and what your unique circumstances are, and trying to understand when something is coming up and somebody is reacting strongly to something or overreacting, you may think, seek first to understand, trying to really figure out what's going on for them. And don't just try to jump into a solution.
Okay. And is that something that you actively try to foster within your team?
I try, as my youngest daughter will tell you, I'm, as an engineer and as a father, and as a man, I think I try to jump to solutions too quickly sometimes. So my daughter once had this great phrase for me, which was, she said, "Dad, when I come to you with a problem, you should ask me, which one do I want? Do I want you to solve the problem? Do I want you to distract me? Or do I want you to just listen?" And I think as a leader, I jump normally to the, great, let's solve the problem. Sometimes it's just listening, or sometimes
Mm,
distracting the person.
certainly. Great advice there. This has been fascinating. I'm curious, Doug, is there perhaps an aspect or two around workplace culture that you find doesn't get much airtime? If so, what would they be?
Yeah, I think that's one of the fascinating things as we've been digging into our AI strategy has been the aha moment for all of us on ChatGPT and these LLMs had been about natural language interfaces to systems. Right? And one of the things when you start thinking about that on top of people systems are, what are the interesting questions to go ask? And
Hmm.
there's obviously easy ones like, how many employees we have in the Chicago office, or who hasn't gotten any recognition in the last 6 months. But the more existential ones are, which managers have the most connected teams, or are the most effective, or which groups are the most risk of churn. And so I think as we start to think about these prompts, it's almost like a proxy for what are these bigger questions around culture that we want
Hmm.
to really go answer. And that to me is what I'm so excited about. What we're working on in our journey is how close to answering those and how soon can we answer those kind of questions that most leaders and managers really want to know.
Yeah, certainly. And to wrap things up, if you were listening to this episode, what would you say would be your top takeaway?
I think don't leave culture to chance. I think you have to, it's almost like the Japanese idea of Kaizen, where
Mhm.
it's continuous improvement. I would look at each part of your process that touches an employee, your recruiting process, your onboarding process, your, weekly team meetings, your all hand meetings, even how you say goodbye to people, and figure out how do you make that, improve that in a way that the person feels valued and really feels more connected to the organization and less at every one of those steps.
Yeah, right. And Doug, for those who may be listening, are curious, want to find out more about Airspeed or connect with you, where would you recommend that they head to?
Sure. So we're just at getairspeed.com if you want to go directly to the website, or you can find us in Slack app store as well. I'm really open and transparent. So if you email D, the letter D at getairspeed, you'll reach me. And happy to go answer.
Brilliant. We'll include links to those in the show notes. Doug, this has been very enlightening. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you very much. It's been fun.